So it's really hard to win the Super Bowl. I think everybody can agree with that. Even if you're a Patriots fan, as many times as your team has won the Super Bowl in recent history, there are more years they haven't won it or even made it than they've actually won it. So for the Philadelphia Eagles, with all that happened last year, to go on and end up being Super Bowl 52 champions, you couldn't blame them if they just kind of sat on their laurels and went through 2018 and weren't quite the same team. And to be fair, they really weren't. From starting off the season with Nick Foles as a starter because Carson Wentz was still coming back from the ACL injury, to it just felt like there was a little bit of a hangover, a little bit of a lull here for this organization. Even with the additions in the offseason of guys like Michael Bennett and Olodi Nada, the thought being, hey, this team really isn't losing much, and they're gaining guys that can bring value, guys that bring some depth on that defensive line that was already really good. Keeping all these other key components and perhaps having Carson Wentz back for a full season, this team could be even better. And they weren't that. They weren't that. And the first half of the year was a real struggle. Foles struggled to start off the year, then Carson Wentz came in, and he kind of shuffled and scuffled along too. The Eagles sat there at the bye. They were only 4-4. And when you looked at it at that time, you were waiting for them to piece it together, but not fully sure they ever were going to piece it together, especially when they came off of the bye and then they lost to back-to-back weeks to Dallas and they got steamrolled by New Orleans. Now all of a sudden you're talking about an Eagles team that's 4-6. They look bad, and it looked like their season was just about over. But I'll give the Eagles credit for this. They acted like champions, and they did what champions should do, which is when their backs are against the wall, they respond, and they respond in a big way, just like the Eagles did, which is why they won 5 of their last 6 games and found a way to get into the back door of the playoffs. From 4-6 to making the playoffs, it's pretty damn good work if you can get it. Got a little help from my Bears in Week 17, and then again in the wild card round. Oh, that road playoff win in Soldier Field. More can I really say? It stings, still hurts, but the Eagles deserved it. More can you say? And it's pretty impressive when you think about it to go from, 2017, nobody having really big-time championship aspirations for this team and feeling maybe they're at least 1 year away from even the playoffs, to winning the Super Bowl with a backup quarterback to come back the next year, make a late season run, get into the playoffs in the back door, and then win a road playoff game. And that's a real testament to that Eagles roster and especially head coach Doug Peterson and his staff to keep this team bought in, to not give up, to not quit, and ultimately get business done. And they went down to New Orleans the next week, and they were game. They put up a really good fight, and they had a chance late to potentially tie it up or, God knows, maybe even win it until the ball went through Alshon Jeffrey's hands. So for a surprise Super Bowl champion to come back the next year when things weren't looking so great and still find a way to slide into the playoffs and still make it into the divisional round, you got to classify that as a pretty good season. And what did we see out of the Eagles this year? Well, offensively, they weren't a great running team. They kind of had a bit of a roulette wheel at the running back position. They were pretty good in the passing game, top 10 in passing yards per game. Zach Ertz had a record season with 116 receptions as a tight end, which I believe are the most ever in history. But you could tell at times with Wentz, even though statistically his numbers weren't bad, it felt like there was something a little missing from this offense. And early on in the season, as much as everybody focused on Foles late in the year, early on in the year, he stunk pretty bad too. Defensively, this team was very good against the run, 7th against the run, really bad against the pass, which we saw in the Super Bowl last year, and that definitely manifested and carried over into 2018. They just struggled to stop teams in the passing game, which is crazy when you look at the fact that they can generate some pass rush with their front four. Fletcher Cox had 10.5 sacks. Michael Bennett, one of their big acquisitions in the offseason, had 9 sacks. So this is a team you would think with their ability to generate some pressure with their front four wouldn't have the struggles that they do in the passing game on defense, and yet they do because their secondary stinks. Absolutely stinks. But it's really hard to play at the same level 2 consecutive years. It really is. Like, even if you say, well, the Patriots do. Yeah, but the Patriots don't win the championship every single year. In terms of the 2018 draft class, the Eagles didn't get a ton, but they got some good players like Dallas Goedert and Avonte Maddox who you expect to be bigger contributors down the road for this team. For a team that really didn't put a lot of stock in the last year's draft. The fact they got anything out of it was still really good. And they positioned themselves well by trading out around one. They've got a second-round pick from Baltimore this year, so they should be able to utilize that. Challenge for the Eagles right now is they're over the salary cap by about $5 million. I know they've reworked Jason Kelsey's deal, gave him an extension, which means they were shifting cap money around. I know they gave Brandon Graham, I think, a 3-year contract extension, which, again, was nice because he was one of their key free agents. You had to wonder whether or not they're going to bring back in full. But this is a team that's over $5 million over the salary cap. You got 3 wide receivers, Mike Wallace, Golden Tate, Jordan Matthews. You're going to have to make some decisions on, especially Golden Tate, who you made that trade for in the middle of the season. You got to make a decision on Haloti Ngata, Jordan Hicks, Ronald Darby. And then the big decision comes in with Nick Foles, which we believe we already know. The Eagles have said they're going to let Nick Foles hit free agency, which means it's basically goodbye, sayonara, see you. As it exactly should be. For all these people that are clamoring for Nick Foles to be the Eagles starting quarterback long term, why would you invest big-time money into a quarterback like Foles who hasn't really shown you a ton in terms of being able to sustain at a certain level on a consistent basis? And are we forgetting the fact that when he came into the season as a starter in 2018, his first couple of games, it was not good. People were clamoring for Carson Wentz to come back. Then Wentz came back, and then all of a sudden Foles is God again. You got Wentz, 2 years left on his rookie year. This is not a hard decision to make. You keep Carson Wentz 100 out of 100 times. Sure, it'll suck to see Nick Foles go out the door, probably to Jacksonville or somewhere like that, but it's the right decision long-term for this organization. You invested a lot of draft pick capital to go get Carson Wentz. You need to find out over these next 2 years whether he can be that guy, whether he can stay healthy to be able to prove to be that guy. And if not, at that point in time, then you got to worry about it. But what you can't do when your team already over the salary cap is think about investing $20+ million into the quarterback position for a guy who's never going to be a franchise guy or an elite guy. That's just stupid. That's bad business in today's NFL. And Howie Roseman, fortunately for Eagles fans, is smart enough to recognize that. It will be interesting to see what he does in terms of some of the bigger names that could potentially have some appeal as cap casualties, like Jason Peters, Timmy Jernigan, Chris Long. You got to figure out a way to create some salary cap room somewhere. And you might have to cut a couple of these guys that you really don't want to. Maybe Michael Bennett gets thrown into the mix, although I doubt it based off of how good of a season he had in 2018. The Eagles are in a position right now where they didn't really need a lot, which is good, especially because they're already over the salary cap. What they do need, though, they need to be able to try and find in the draft because they need young, cheap options here. Running back. I like Josh Adams, but I don't think he's a long-term bell cow starter for them. They need a number one type of back, and frankly, I don't know if Ajayi's that guy either. Then I look defensively. They could use a lot of youth and depth and speed at all levels of their defense, obviously at corner. I know they've invested some trade and some draft pick capital into corner, and it's still an issue. They need to address that early, multiple times in this draft. I think they could use a young safety, that's for sure. I look at that front. I think they could use some depth at defensive tackle. I think they could use some speed and athleticism at outside linebacker. The reality is, though, is that this Eagles team is good, and they've got their core in place for the most part, you would think, for another year. They might have a few guys leave due to the salary cap concerns, but none of the guys remaining that they could lose feels like the type of guy that you absolutely must keep no matter what. It feels like they have guys that if they keep them, great, and if they don't, that's okay too. And that's a good position to be in for the Eagles. This is a really good team that made a really good showing of it this year that if they keep people healthy and can get off to a better start, could be dangerous in 2019.